Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 27. We are going to jump in today with sort of an extension from last week's episode on aging and Alzheimer's and dementia. So a viewer said, wow, I just heard about this age reversal pill that works in dogs by extending their telomeres. I was wondering if you know anything about the promise of our dogs living 50 years or even more.
Fantastic question. Telomeres. Let me talk about telomeres first before talking about telomeres in dogs. Telomeres, something found inside of cells. So you got your DNA. I've got a teaching tool here. You got your DNA, which is a long strand of nucleic base pairs, and this long strand will have a gene here, and a gene here, and a gene here, and on-off switches in between regulatory elements. So chromosomes made up of long strands of DNA, and you look at the very end, and there's a stretch of DNA that doesn't code for a gene, doesn't code for an on-off switch, but as required by law, you always have to use this metaphor. It's like the little plastic wrapping around the end of a shoelace. This is the telomere. What's it good for? Number of things. First off, every now and then DNA gets severed, and both strands, you get what's called a double-stranded break, and there's enzymes that will come and stitch them back together. Telomeres make sure those enzymes don't screw up and decide that this was actually once one strand of DNA and stitch them back here, so that prevents that from happening. In addition, the telomeres provide some stability, but they also provide something else. This is really interesting in terms of aging. Okay, lots of folks will have heard of Henrietta Lacks, written up her history in a book that faithful viewers, listeners will remember Rachel mentioned some episodes ago. Henrietta Lacks, impoverished African-American woman in Baltimore in the 1950s, got a particularly aggressive cancer. This wound up killing her. And near her death, some of the cells from her tumor were taken by doctors without her permission, without her knowledge, all of that. And those cells turned out to be wonderful if you weren't her. But what they did was they divided forever. They were immortal. And these were immortalized into a cell line named for her, Henrietta Lacks, HeLa cells. And what are they good for? You need just a big batch of cells that are growing and uniform, and you go for your lab experiment, you go and you buy a bunch of HeLa cells. In other words, people spend decades making money selling HeLa cells before somebody figured out that actually this was not okay, and some reparations have been made since. In any case, what you had here was an immortalized cell line that just kept dividing forever and ever, as long as you fed the cells. That's in contrast to your normal cells, which divide only a certain number of times. Famous gerontologist, a guy named Leonard Hayflick, who actually died 2 weeks ago at age 96, Hayflick was the first one to show in normal cells, they divide a fixed number of times before that ceases, before that halts. And this is called the Hayflick limit, how many rounds of cell division any given new cell goes through. And he should have gotten way more famous for this than he was. But nonetheless, Hayflick limit, at some point, the cells stop dividing. So the question is, what stops them from dividing? And here we get back to our telomeres. It turns out every round of cell division, with that division, this telomeres get a little bit shorter. And the next round, they get a little bit shorter, until eventually you get to a point, second teaching item here, where the telomeres completely frayed off and you've got a raggedy, rotten end to your DNA, which is the signal for the cell to stop dividing. It goes into cellular arrest because there's no more telomere at the end serving as that signal. And at that point, it doesn't necessarily die. It becomes this very trendy thing studied these days, senescent zombie cells that sit there and spill out all sorts of rust and crud and gunk onto their neighbors. And what people immediately put together when they saw that shortening of telomeres with each round of cell division, forming a senescent zombie shoe, what that immediately suggested is telomere shortening is the pacemaker of cellular aging. And people got totally wild about this. This was the fundamental clock ticking away, and your telomeres getting shorter. And when they're short enough to get all raggedy, that's it. The cell's done. It's out of business. And of course, what people then immediately wanted to explore was, what are things that maybe make telomeres wither away faster than average, slower than average, and came up with some logical suspects. Lots of stress, including psychological stress, will make telomeres shorten faster in cells of the immune system. Oxygen radicals will accelerate telomere shortening. All the sorts of things that are bad for cells and other living things turn out to accelerate telomere shortening, turn out to accelerate the senescent ceasing of that cell's happy lifespan. So that then got much more complicated in a really interesting way. Okay, telomeres are shortening. Can we devise therapies that would slow down the shortening? And at that point, it was discovered, wonderful scientist Liz Blackburn at UC San Francisco discovered there's an enzyme, telomerase, where what it does is build telomere length back up. It can counteract the shortening. And she wonderfully got a Nobel Prize for this and is famed and lauded for this. And suddenly this doubled your palette. Ooh, we could prevent zombification of your cells by either finding a therapy that slows down the attrition of your telomeres, or a therapy that perks up the activity of that telomerase enzyme to build it back up. And all sorts of excitement with that, and building on this notion that if you can come up with interventions that extend telomeres, that slow down their shortening, any of that, that will extend maximal lifespan. And at this point, you can show that in certain types of cells. You can show that in mice. You put in an extra copy of the telomerase gene. You do telomerase gene therapy, things of that sort, and you extend the telomeres and they live longer. All right, so are we suddenly looking at a wonderful solution to aging? Do we now have the means to block the basic cellular pacemaker of aging? There's some problems with this. First of all, is a totally parochial problem, which is if you happen to think the brain is the best part of the body, which I do, neurons don't divide. They never divide. Once a neuron is formed, ninth grade biology jargon, it is post-mitotic. So the fact that telomeres are sitting there in neurons, they don't particularly get shorter. They don't go through cell division. You don't get neurons that cease cell division and become zombie cells. None of this applies to neurons. So that greatly decreases my enthusiasm for the whole thing. The bigger problem, though, is what I already alluded to. Yeah, we are made of nothing but flesh, and eventually flesh is kind of destined to stop dividing unless something goes really wrong, and it keeps dividing and dividing and dividing forever and ever. And what have you just defined? That's what cancer is. Cancer is when cell division overcomes all the normal signals that say enough cell divisions, you have formed the organ you need to form, you're arrested at this point. Cancer is cell division that goes out of control. And what has people terrified of even thinking about telomere therapy to extend lifespan is you get it a little bit wrong, and nobody knows what really counts as right all that much. You get a little bit wrong, and quite possibly, instead of extending lifespan, you're inventing a type of cancer. So that's the story with telomeres. And if you're wondering, yes, this is paid product placement for Merrill shoes, even though it's suggesting that they're telomeres fall apart at the same speed. But what about telomeres in dogs? The question, no, it's not there yet. It's not going to be there for a long time until people solve the problem of, are you going to cause cancer instead of extending lifespan? But it would be wonderful to have our dogs live 50 years or so. There'd be a downside in that you'd have to completely recalculate what counts as dog years, the same way as, like global warming, you got to recalculate glaciers no longer move at glacial speeds and the sea is above sea level and things. But that'll get sorted out, but it's not there yet. Unfortunately, we and our dogs are stuck with our current mortality. So that's telomeres.
All right, so next, someone asks, can autism be modified by exercises sometime in the future? Perhaps by influences that enforce neuron pathways across the brain? By building a bridge between isolated islands, traffic will begin to increase between the islands. If the brain is plastic, perhaps autism and other problems should not be considered static conditions.
Wonderful. And autism most certainly should not be thought of as a static condition, as very few things in biology are. Autism, neurodevelopmental disorder, where you get a whole bunch of problems. Some in the social realm, individuals are unattuned to social cues, very bad at reading them, bad at expressing them, but a whole bunch of cognitive traits as well, a tendency towards perseverating on thoughts, stereotypical movement, repetition of that sort, and an emphasis on what's called systematizing thought rather than integrative. You're focusing on the trees rather than the forest. And there turns out to be a great anatomical underpinning of this systematizing isolated function deal, which is when you look at neurons in the cortex. I think this is something covered in a previous episode, but you look at neurons in the cortex, and here's the area of the cortex that does X, and here's a neuron that connects to this neuron and this neuron, and you ask, how far away are the neurons it's connected to? Lots of little local ones to preserve local expertise, long distance ones for creative problem solving, for associating things not otherwise associated. And what people saw, some really tedious studies, is on the average, the projections of cortical neurons in the brains of people with autism spectrum disorder, are shorter than average. In other words, more isolated islands of function, often function greatly enhanced because of that density, but islands that are not as connected with each other. And the question builds on exactly the plasticity thing we talked about the other week. If you use certain pathways, they will strengthen, they will expand, they will grow new connections. And the notion was that if you can get people with autism, sort of training them to do things that will connect systematically separated islands of function, of thought, of affect, things of that sort, that could overcome some of the features of autism. And that, in a fancy neurobiological way, is exactly what is done. You have people who specialize in working typically with kids with autism, helping them achieve what's called theory of mind. When do you first realize somebody else has different thoughts than you do? And kids typically ages 3 through 5, when they get them, individuals with autism often have big problems with theory of mind because they don't have a theory of an other individual having a separate existence. And there's exercises you can take somebody through to sort of get them to think, oh, does that person know what you know? Do they know something that you don't know? Are they a separate entity of cognition? And what are you doing there? You're taking islands that have to do with me and thought, and you're extending them into somebody else's thought as well. Obviously ridiculously simplistic, but that's exactly what's going on at some level. And then you could take it to the next step, and there's very mixed findings as to whether people with autism have typical levels of empathy. And it turns out it depends heavily on who you're asking them to be empathic about. just like in people without autism. It's got something to do with IQ as well, but that's thought to be a stepping stone. When kids first figure out, ooh, somebody has different thoughts than me, they then develop into somebody can have different feelings, emotions than me, and a whole extra bridge there. And this is part of making more of a bridge, and you're expanding the wiring. The one single projection from this island to that now gets more elaborated. It gets thicker. It becomes more efficacious through repeated use. Yeah, absolutely, it would work that way. So does this mean that potentially any brain is plastic enough to achieve anything, including brains of individuals with autism, to overcome some of these deficits, all of that? No. Logically, plasticity is wonderful. You could have neuroplasticity into your 90s, all of that. That's great, but it has its limits. No degree of practicing piano 10,000 hours a week is ever going to make me sound like Yuja Wang. No degree of practice is ever going to make an adult learn a new language and be able to have a perfect accent of a native speaker. Or suddenly you start trying to use your non-dominant hands for things, and it's never going to be quite right. There's always going to be limitations there. So there's a ceiling. There's a ceiling as to how much you can do that, and that's okay. But nonetheless, that's absolutely efficacious, and that's a lot of what social training is about for individuals with autism. And what you see is the signs that connections have been made, but they're painfully, obviously, not natural, not intuitive. There's this YouTube sort of clip of somebody teaching individuals with autism how to avoid the issue of oversharing. You're enthusiastic about a subject and you just unbidden talk to somebody about it for 30 minutes and they don't want to hear it. And sort of training, here's what you do. You want to tell the person, you've discovered they're interested in a shared interest of yours, you want to tell them about what you know about it. Say to them first, do you want the 1-minute version or the 10-minute version? And if they say the 10-minute one, go start talking. Otherwise, just do like a 1-sentence version. And at some point, stop and say, do you want to hear more about it? Or should I stop here? And this is just artificially making bridges, connections there of check in with the person you're talking to. Don't forget, they may want to say something, and we know this is not normal behavior, and that one normally has a pretty good intuition. When they're beginning to go on too long, bore somebody, they may decide, nonetheless, I don't care because talking is more important to me. But we don't often say every 3 minutes when describing something lengthy, is that enough? Should I go on further? We intuit it. And giving something as clunky as every few minutes stop and say that shows you there's a tremendous capacity for neuroplasticity when somebody gets good at doing that. But the fact that it will always be this clunky sort of thing shows the limitations of it. And you see that will come in all sorts of ways where tying isolated islands of function through neuroplasticity produces better social comprehension, but still don't necessarily work all that smoothly. You get someone on the spectrum who has to be trained how to recognize when something sarcastic is being said. Oh, we have a flat tire. Great, just what we need. No, that's not really what we need. No, sometimes people say exactly the opposite of what they mean. That's what sarcasm is. Or sometimes people will be hyperbolic. They will say, that was the worst movie in the history of humankind. And no, they don't really mean it. That, okay, that's what hyperbolic extensions are about. Here's the rules for doing that. And what you see is there's a lot of stuff that can get better through training along exactly the neurobiological lines that the question brings up, but there's limits on it. All of this brings us to a final point here, which is the blitheness which I've been referring to autism as a neurodevelopmental disorder. And that is controversial as hell, and Autism, as the formal name now, autism spectrum disorder, comes on a huge spectrum, and it is absolutely arbitrary where you draw the line between us and them, where you draw the line between this is a disorder that seriously impairs your normal functioning, or this is just another version of normal human variety and has its own hidden blessings and such. Very controversial. It is clear that the old model of pathologized neurological disorder doesn't apply. It's on a continuum. So that's that controversy.
So finally, Diana from Columbia/Germany asks, how do you explain the nonsense of meritocracy to a person who is proud of something and has a tendency to depression?
Well, that's a really tough, profound question for which I don't have very good answers. And the answers that I do have are much more a function of opinion than science. But let's break that into two parts. The problem of somebody dealing with depression, that's the problem of 15% of humans. Some of the time, depression is abstractly linked to looking for a sense of purpose and meaning, and I sure don't have good advice there. But a lot of the time, depression cognitively is about you've decided you're helpless in the world, you're hopeless. So by definition, if you're somebody who is good at something, who has something to be proud about, you've got efficacy in at least one domain in your life. Use that as a foothold on the beach there to begin to build out from more of a sense of control and predictability, all of that. Okay, but the more fundamental question is whether or not you're dealing with depression. Meritocracies make no sense, and that's really hard for us to deal with in the context of stuff we feel proud of. Meritocracies make no sense. If there's no such thing as free will, if we are nothing more than the biological luck we were handed and its interactions with the environmental luck we were just handed, we had no control, no entitlement, no whatever, not only does it make no sense to ever, on one shoe, ever blame someone or punish them, and thus the whole criminal justice system has to be revised. At the same time, it makes equally little sense to ever praise or reward someone, and thus meritocracies make no sense either. Now, taking that apart, one piece of that is not so hard to tackle, because everyone recognizes some people have natural attributes. Some people just turn out to be tall enough to dunk a basketball. Some people turn out to have perfect pitch. Some people turn out to have the right sort of extroverted personality so that people like them, all of that. You're handed natural attributes. And even though we have a pull towards trying to congratulate someone on their natural attributes, when you stop somebody and make them really think through it, they'll say, yeah, actually, they had nothing to do with it. So that we're pretty good at, and meritocracy is built on people just happening to be born with perfect pitch or destined to be tall enough to dunk basketballs and all of that. When you really take it apart, people will recognize this doesn't make much sense. But then there's the other half of it. Yeah, we're all handed natural attributes we had no control over, but what do we do with them? Do we show tenacity? Do we get going when the tough get going? When the going gets tough, do we fight through the pain? Do we do all of that? What do we do with the natural attributes we've been given? And there's this gigantic temptation to make a false dichotomy. Natural attributes, those are made of biology. What you do with your attributes, are you disciplined? Do you work hard? Are you self-indulgent and you squander your gifts? What you do with it, that's not made out of biology. That's made out of like fairy dust and Calvinist ethics. And the whole point there, what does in meritocracies is having a natural attribute and what you're able to do with it are absolutely equally biological. There's a biology over which you had no control if you wound up being somebody who's good at impulse control. and gratification postponement. And there's all sorts of developmental pathways by which some people are better at it than others out of pure nuts and bolts neurobiology they had no control over. Some people, for reasons they had no control over, will wind up being people where at every juncture in the road they will take the wrong path. And that's not their choice. It's not your choice to be self-disciplined. It's not your choice to be able to look the other way when there's temptation or things. None of that is made of anything other than biology. Insofar as there is no free will in our natural attributes, there's no free will in what you do with them. And thus a meritocracy, the notion that because some people are good at certain things, they should be treated better than the average human, has no intellectual or ethical basis at all. So what do you do, though, with someone who, amid that, has accomplished something difficult and feels proud of it? And I've gotten letters from various people who've been hostile about, oh, this no free will crap, you're just going to have murderers running around in the streets. The much more compelling ones is some letters I've gotten from people who have said, I grew up lacking every possible advantage. I had everything going against me. At some point, I got it together and I worked like hell and things turned out okay. And I made myself into this. Are you telling me I have nothing to be proud of? Screw you. This is who I am. This defines my sense of my worth, that I was able to make do with lemons and working really hard. How dare you say there's no free will in that? And that's a very painful sort of email to read, because it's saying, if you have worked hard to achieve something, should you feel proud of it? And the answer is, no, it actually doesn't make any sense. You just happen to be good at self-discipline. You just happen to be good at those various traits. You just happen to be. You turned out to be that sort of person. So what do we do with that? So we look at all the different ways that you could be good at something. And what you begin to realize is a lot of the time being good at something means you could be helpful at something. You could be good at making people laugh. You could be good at transplanting people's kidneys. You could be good at understanding supply chains so you keep prices low in the grocery. You run for your neighbors. You could be good at being faithful in a relationship. You could be good at resourcing humans or whatever people do in HR. You could be good in figuring out how to stop some fern from going extinct. And even though nobody will realize this, that's actually helping humanity as well. There's lots of ways in which being good at something translates out into you can be helpful. That's not always the case. You could have been Genghis Khan's Soldier of the Month after some slaughter that you led, or you could be incredibly good at, as a pharmaceutical rep, getting Rust Belt small town doctors in Ohio to prescribe OxyContin to their patients. And yeah, being good at something isn't automatically synonymous with being able to do good. But it usually doesn't take a whole lot of work to figure out how you could connect an expertise at something and connect that with, and that makes things a better place. And what that allows you to do is make this critical transition from what do I feel in the face of my being good at this? Proud. Doesn't make any sense. A segue to instead thinking, how do I feel in the face of my being able to do this? Grateful. And I think that's the key transition, where one accepts there's no such thing as a meritocracy. It makes no sense whatsoever. And what you do in the face of you've worked hard as hell to get good at something, be grateful rather than proud. I am not jealous of many people, but probably the person I've been most jealous of in my life is Jonas Salk. Jonas Salk made the first polio vaccine. I did my postdoc at the Salk Institute in San Diego. He was still alive at the time. He'd come to some seminars, and I would get weak-kneed seeing him, because you're a scientist, you study disease, you just work and work and work and work in the hope that one day you're going to be able to take down one of these diseases. Or at least you're going to be one of 100 people who collectively does so. And you look at him, and he's the guy who did it. He took it down. He hit the pot of gold like nobody in science ever does. He changed the world figuring out how to make this vaccine. And I would feel envy at it. Any scientist feels envy when somebody pulls it off, as he did. And it's taken me a while to have a transition from it is so great that he could be proud of all the good that he did to it's so great and worthy of envy that he could be so grateful for all the good that he did. So if you got to choose, being grateful is always better than being prideful. That said, this is preaching to my own not very good choir, because it takes me a lot to decide that gratitude is better than pride. But in any case, that's, I think, what we do with the fact that meritocracies make no sense, yet we have to work very hard to get it good at some stuff, which has a good chance of being helpful. And that paves the way for making it all seem worth it, because you can feel grateful that you happen to turn out to be that sort of person.
And that concludes episode 27. So keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight in bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Share Sapolsky, and thanks, we are very grateful for your continued support of Science and the Beard.